Tonight, we'll explore the beliefs and practices surrounding mirrors, from the very first humans who peered into still water and wondered at their own reflection, through the ancient civilizations that feared the soul could be stolen by a glance, through the candlelit seance rooms of Victorian England, all the way to the blue light of our phone screens and the strange new mirrors we carry in our pockets. We'll journey through 10 quiet chapters together. In the primordial gaze, we'll sit with our earliest ancestors and ask what they made of their own reflection. In the Soul Stealers, we'll visit ancient Greece and Rome, where mirrors were draped in cloth for reasons that made perfect sense to those who lived there. In Bloody Mary and Ritual Invitations, we'll follow the long history of mirror summoning rituals and what psychology has since made of them. In Victorian Shadows and Seance, we'll enter the drawing rooms of the spiritualism movement, where mirrors became instruments of contact. In the uncanny valley of the self, we'll consider the strange neurological experience of not quite recognizing your own face. In Neural Mirrors and Echo Chambers, we'll look at what mirror neurons tell us about empathy and what digital screens have done to them. In Quantum Reflections, we'll glance at what modern physics says about the nature of reflection and the quiet paranoia of smart technology. In The Digital Mirror, we'll turn to social media filters and artificial intelligence, the mirrors of our current age. In Architectural Portals, we'll walk through rooms built from mirrors, the infinity corridors and liminal spaces that have unsettled visitors for centuries. And finally, in The Final Reflection, we'll gather everything together and sit quietly with what it means to look. Before we begin this journey, if you enjoy these calm explorations of historical beliefs and folklore, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. New videos arrive regularly, each one a slow, unhurried passage through some corner of human history that tends to be overlooked. And if you're drawn to the world of cottagecore and mystical themes we explore here, you might enjoy our curated collection of shirts. The link is in the description below. Now, settle in, get comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights a little, or let the darkness outside the window be enough. There is no hurry here. These stories have waited thousands of years, and they will unfold gently, as all good things do. Before there were mirrors, there was water. Imagine, if you will, the earliest moments of human self-awareness. A hominid crouching beside a still pool in the fading amber of an African afternoon, perhaps 100,000 years ago or more. The world around them would have been full of motion, the ripple of grass, the shifting of shadows, the subtle language of living things. And then, in a patch of water undisturbed by wind, something extraordinary. A face looking back. We cannot know what that first encounter felt like from the inside, but we can reason about it. To see your own face in reflection is not an instinctive experience. It is a learned one. Very young human children and most animals do not recognize themselves in mirrors. They react to their reflection as though encountering another creature. The moment of self-recognition, when it finally arrives in a child's development somewhere around 18 months of age, is considered a significant developmental milestone. The emergence of what psychologists call a sense of self. For our ancient ancestors, that moment of recognition may have been profoundly disorienting. Here was an image that moved when you moved, that mimicked your every gesture with uncanny precision. And yet it was silent, untouchable, separated from you by the surface of the water. It was you, and yet it was not you. it existed in another world, just below the surface of your own. This duality, the self and its double, sits at the heart of nearly every mirror superstition that humanity has ever produced. Long before anyone built a reflective surface from metal or glass, the reflected image raised questions that no one had language to answer. What was that thing in the water? Was it a part of you or something separate? If you looked too long, could it take something from you? If the water was disturbed and the image shattered, did some fragment of you shatter with it? These were not foolish questions. They were, in their own way, the first philosophical inquiries into the nature of identity and consciousness. Across many of the world's oldest cultures, the answer that eventually emerged to these questions was this: the reflected image was the soul. Not a symbol of the soul, not a metaphor for it, but the actual, tangible presence of the self's deepest essence, made visible by the act of reflection. The ancient Egyptians had a concept they called the Ka, often translated as the life force or spiritual double. The Ka was understood as a kind of twin that accompanied a person throughout their life, born alongside them and departing at death. In tomb paintings and carvings, the Ka was frequently depicted as a mirror image of the deceased, identical in every detail, but somehow separate. The Ka needed to be nourished after death, which is why food offerings were placed in tombs, and it needed a vessel to return to, which is partly why the preservation of the physical body through mummification was so important. Egyptian mirrors from this period are remarkable objects. Many were made from highly polished bronze or copper, shaped into circles or ovals, and mounted on handles carved from wood or ivory. The circular mirror itself was sometimes referred to in hieroglyphs, using a symbol that also meant sun, the reflection of light, the source of all seeing. These were not casual objects. They were ceremonial, often buried with their owners, understood to be necessary for the journey that lay beyond life. Move westward and forward in time to ancient Mesopotamia, the great river civilizations of the Tigris and Euphrates, and you find mirror beliefs woven into the fabric of divination. Polished metal surfaces were used by priests and seers to read omens. The way a flame reflected the shadows that gathered at the edge of a polished bowl filled with oil or water. These were the texts from which futures were read. Mirrors were understood to be porous in a way that ordinary surfaces were not, permeable to the movements of the invisible world. This idea, that the reflective surface is a threshold, appears in ancient Chinese thought as well. The earliest Chinese mirrors, bronze discs polished to a high shine on one side and decorated with intricate symbolic patterns on the other, were associated with cosmic order. The decorated back of the mirror was often engraved with images of heaven, of the mountain at the center of the world, of the animals associated with the four directions. To hold such a mirror was to hold a cosmological instrument, a model of the universe in your hands. The reflective face looked outward at you. The decorated face looked inward at the structure of all things. There is a quiet logic to the idea that reflective surfaces are special. Even from a purely physical standpoint, a mirror does something strange. It reverses the world. Your right hand becomes the left hand of the figure in the glass. The words on a page, held up to a mirror, become unreadable. The reflected world is the world, and yet it is also its inverse, a place where the rules are subtly, disturbingly different. For ancient peoples who did not have optical physics to explain this reversal, the inverted world of the reflection was naturally understood as another world entirely, a parallel realm where things were almost the same but not quite, a place governed by different rules. In the folklore of many indigenous cultures around the world, from the Americas to Polynesia to sub-Saharan Africa, still water is treated with a particular kind of respect. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. The reflected world has its own inhabitants, its own properties. To stare too long into still water is to risk becoming lost in it. To see your reflection disturbed or distorted is an omen. The Aztec deity, Tezcatlipoca, whose name translates roughly as smoking mirror, was associated with the night sky, with obsidian, and with a mirror that could show a person the truth of their own soul, including the manner and hour of their death. This was not a comfortable mirror. It was a mirror of revelation, of confrontation. To look into Tezcatlipoca's mirror was to be seen entirely, with no possibility of concealment. Obsidian itself, the volcanic glass from which many Mesoamerican mirrors were made, has a quality that other materials lack. Its surface is black. It does not show you a bright, cheerful reflection. It shows you something darker, more ambiguous, a shadowy double, a version of yourself stripped of color and clarity. Many contemporary practitioners of mirror scrying still prefer obsidian for precisely this reason. The image it gives back is not quite real, not quite unreal. It exists at the edge of recognition. What all of these ancient traditions share is an understanding that the act of looking at your own reflection is not a neutral act. It is an encounter. You are not simply checking your appearance. You are making contact with something, a double, a soul, a spirit, a version of yourself that exists in another dimension of being. Whether or not you believe in souls or spirit worlds, there is something psychologically true in this intuition. We will return to the neuroscience of self-recognition in a later chapter, but for now, it is enough to note that seeing your own face is genuinely unusual from a biological standpoint. Most of your experience of the world comes to you from outside yourself. You see the world, not yourself. Your face is the one thing you can only ever encounter through reflection. It is, in a very real sense, always slightly other. In that otherness, in that slight strangeness of the familiar, our ancestors found the raw material for some of the most enduring beliefs in human history. Rest with that for a moment. Somewhere in the long story of humanity, a person looked into still water and felt that something was looking back. Everything else we will discuss tonight grew from that single, quiet encounter. There is a story most of us know, though we may have forgotten its original meaning. A young man kneels beside a pool of water. He has been told by a prophet that he will live a long life, provided he never comes to know himself. He is beautiful, extraordinarily so, in the way that myths tend to make their subjects beautiful. And nymphs have loved him, and a mountain echo has loved him, and he has turned them all away. And now, resting by the water, he sees his own face for what may be the first time, and he cannot look away. He stays. He wastes. He dies by the water, still gazing. The myth of Narcissus, as Ovid tells it in his Metamorphoses, is usually read today as a story about vanity. But its older layers are about something else entirely. The danger of the reflection. Narcissus does not fall in love with himself out of pride. He falls in love with what he believes to be another being, a spirit in the water, a presence that seems to respond to him with perfect understanding. Only slowly does he begin to suspect the terrible truth. The thing he loves is him. And in knowing himself, truly seeing himself, he is destroyed. For the ancient Greeks, this was not merely a metaphor. The belief that seeing your own reflection too clearly, too deeply, was dangerous, was woven into their understanding of the soul and its vulnerabilities. The Greek concept of the psyche, the soul, was understood to be something both present within the body and somehow loosely attached to it. The soul could be seen in the reflection of the eyes of another person, which is why we still use the word pupil, from the Latin for little doll, the tiny reflection of yourself you can see in another's gaze. It could also be visible in the reflection of still water, or in the polished surface of a mirror. If the soul was visible in the reflection, then the reflection was in some sense the soul, or at least a part of it, a fragment made accessible. And if the reflection could be damaged, if the mirror cracked, if the water was disturbed, then the soul might be damaged too. This is the oldest known source of the superstition that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck. The number 7 is Roman in origin. Roman thinkers believed that the human body renewed itself completely every 7 years. Every cell, every tissue replaced in a long, slow cycle. To break a mirror was to break the image of the soul. The soul would remain damaged, the logic ran, until it had completed 1 full cycle of renewal. 7 years. The Romans were, in many respects, more pragmatic about mirrors than the Greeks. They used them widely in private baths and dressing rooms for personal grooming and adornment. Roman mirrors made from polished silver and bronze were luxury objects owned by wealthy households. And there is a cheerful, worldly quality to many of the mirror customs recorded from this period. And yet the superstitions persisted, because they spoke to something deeper than fashion or habit. When a Roman fell seriously ill, the mirrors in the household were often turned to face the wall, or covered with cloth. The reasoning was protective. The sick person's soul was already weakened, already partially loosened from its moorings. To see oneself in that weakened state, to allow the soul's reflection to be observed, was to risk losing the soul entirely, having it drawn out through the surface of the mirror and into whatever lay beyond. The practice of covering mirrors in the house of the recently deceased, still observed today in Jewish mourning tradition, in parts of southern Europe, in various American folk customs, descends directly from this ancient belief. The soul of the dead person has just departed. It may still be in the room, confused, not yet certain of its new state. If it sees its own reflection, it might linger. Or the reflection might capture it. Or the mirrors might show the living members of the household their own souls, weakened by grief, at risk. Different traditions give slightly different reasons for covering mirrors at the time of death. In some, it is to prevent the spirit of the deceased from seeing themselves and becoming vain or distracted. In others, it is to protect the living from accidentally looking into a mirror and seeing death standing behind them. In others still, it is simply an act of respect. The house is in mourning. Beauty and vanity are inappropriate. The mirrors have nothing useful to show. What is consistent across all these variations is the understanding that the mirror, at times of spiritual vulnerability, is a liability. The threshold is too thin. Something might cross it that should not. Greek mythology is full of mirror-adjacent imagery. Perseus, who slays the Medusa, the creature whose direct gaze turns men to stone, does so by using his polished shield as a mirror. He looks at her reflection, not at her directly. The reflection is safe. The direct gaze is death. The mirror interposes a layer of protection between the viewer and the terrible thing that must be seen. There is something psychologically rich in this story, quite apart from its mythological content. The idea that a reflected image is safer than a direct view, that interposing the mirror changes the nature of what you are looking at, recurs in many contexts. Surgeons in training are sometimes taught to observe difficult procedures through screens or reflective surfaces to reduce the psychological impact. We talk about processing difficult events at a remove, letting time create the reflective distance we need. Perseus and his mirror shield is, among other things, an early story about the wisdom of not looking at some things directly. The Romans also used mirrors in what might be called proto-psychological practice. There were techniques, attributed variously to Pythagoras and others, involving prolonged gazing into a mirror or reflective surface as a means of achieving altered states of consciousness, receiving visions, or communicating with spirits. These practices existed in a gray area between the philosophical and the religious, the kind of thing that was acknowledged but not entirely respectable, practiced in private by those with esoteric interests. In parts of ancient Greece, mirrors were associated specifically with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. To give a mirror as a gift was to invoke her blessing. But Aphrodite was also a goddess of considerable power, and her gifts were not always comfortable. Beauty brought attention. Attention brought complication. The mirror that showed you your own loveliness was also, in some sense, showing you your own danger. There is a persistent thread in ancient thought, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Mesopotamian, that to be seen is to be vulnerable. The eye of the observer has power over the observed. This is the root of the evil eye belief, one of the most widespread superstitions in human history. The idea that an envious or malevolent gaze can cause harm to its object. The solution in many traditions is to make the gaze look at itself, to use a reflective amulet, an eye-shaped talisman, a piece of mirror glass sewn into clothing that bounces the dangerous look back at its source. Even today, across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, South Asia, and many other parts of the world, you can find small reflective discs sewn into embroidery, hung in doorways, attached to the harnesses of animals. The logic is unbroken across millennia. The reflection protects. The mirror is a shield. So mirrors in the ancient world were both feared and used as protection. They were dangerous thresholds and also powerful wards. The reflection was both the soul's vulnerable double and a weapon against unseen forces. This tension, mirror as danger, mirror as protection, runs through all the traditions we will explore tonight. Rest with the image of that polished bronze surface, oval and cool, lying in the darkness of an Egyptian tomb. The person it once showed has been gone for 4,000 years. But if you held it up to the light, it would still show you your face, your soul, your briefly visible self, with the same patient, neutral accuracy it always has. You already know the ritual, even if you have never performed it. You stand in a darkened bathroom. You face the mirror. You say a name, Bloody Mary, 3 times, or 13 times, or until the candles you are holding gutter in a draft. And then you wait to see what appears in the glass behind your own reflection. This ritual is among the most widely known pieces of contemporary folklore in the English-speaking world. It has been practiced by generations of children at slumber parties, told and retold in whispers, adapted and elaborated across decades until its origins have become almost impossible to trace. Most people who know the ritual have no idea where it came from. They learned it from a friend who learned it from a friend, in the way that all genuine folklore travels. The scholarly record on Bloody Mary is genuinely interesting, precisely because it resists easy explanation. The name Bloody Mary is most commonly associated with Queen Mary I of England, who reigned from 1553 to 1558 and was given the epithet during her lifetime for her practice of burning Protestant heretics. Mary I was also a deeply unhappy woman, married late, never able to produce a surviving heir, suffering phantom pregnancies that left her devastated, dying at 42. Some folklorists connect the mirror ritual to her story. A queen who longed for a child, who is summoned in the mirror to ask whether the person looking will see a husband or a coffin, the classic questions of a girl's divination ritual. But the evidence for this connection is thin, and the ritual itself is older and stranger than any single historical figure. Mirrors have been used for divination, specifically for the purpose of seeing future husbands, across an enormous range of cultures and time periods. In English folk tradition, a young woman might look into a mirror by candlelight on Halloween, walking backward up the stairs to see the face of her future husband appear over her shoulder. In other versions, she might eat an apple while combing her hair in front of a mirror at midnight, and the man's face would replace her own. These practices are part of a vast category of folk magic that anthropologists call katoptromancy, divination by mirrors. The word comes from the Greek katoptron, meaning mirror, and manteia, meaning divination. The practice is ancient. Greek and Roman sources describe it. Medieval magical texts detail its procedures, and versions of it appear in the folklore of cultures from Japan to Peru. What these rituals have in common is a set of conditions that seem designed, whether consciously or not, to produce altered states of perception. They involve darkness or near darkness. They involve focused, sustained attention on a single reflective surface. They involve repetition, words said again and again, or actions repeated in precise sequence. They involve isolation, often deliberate and sometimes framed as requirement. You must be alone. You must not look away. You must not speak except to say the ritual words. These are, as it happens, almost precisely the conditions that psychologists use to produce specific visual disturbances in laboratory settings. In the early 1990s, the psychologist Giovanni Caputo began researching what happens when people stare at their own faces in a mirror for extended periods in dim lighting. What he found was consistent and somewhat startling. After about 10 minutes, most subjects reported significant visual distortions. Their own faces began to transform. Features enlarged, shrank, or moved. Skin color changed. Expressions appeared that the subject was not making. Many subjects reported seeing the faces of strangers, or of animals, or of figures they described as monstrous. A significant number reported seeing the face of a deceased relative. Caputo called this effect the strange face in the mirror illusion, and subsequent researchers have confirmed it reliably. It is not hallucination in the clinical sense. Subjects know they are looking at a mirror, and the effect stops when the session ends. It appears to be a product of two related phenomena: the brain's tendency to lose focus and begin filling in gaps when sensory input is reduced and monotonous, and the remarkable sensitivity of the human face recognition system, which is so attuned to finding faces that it will construct them from ambiguous visual information. In other words, stand in a dark room, stare at a mirror long enough, and your own brain will show you something other than yourself. It does not require suggestion or belief. It is a feature of human perceptual biology. Now consider that every mirror summoning ritual in the folk record creates exactly these conditions: the darkness, the sustained gaze, the repetitive incantation that directs and holds attention, the isolation that removes other perceptual inputs and leaves only you and the glass, the belief framework that tells you what you might see, priming your face recognition system to find it. This does not mean that the experience of seeing something in the mirror during a ritual is not real. The experience is entirely real. The face that appears, the figure behind the shoulder, the transformation of features. These are genuine perceptions, not inventions. They arise from physical processes in the brain under specific conditions. That they can be explained neurologically does not make them less remarkable or less genuinely strange. It does, however, help us understand why mirror rituals are so culturally persistent. They work. Not in the sense of providing reliable supernatural contact, but in the sense of reliably producing a genuine experience of seeing something unexpected in the glass. Generation after generation performs these rituals, and generation after generation has the experience the ritual promises. The folklore is not lying. It is describing something real through the interpretive framework available to it. The Bloody Mary ritual has been studied in some detail by the folklorist Alan Dundes and others. What emerges from these studies is a picture of the ritual as primarily a puberty rite, something performed by adolescent girls, almost always in groups, almost always in the context of a sleepover or similar social occasion. The questions the ritual is supposed to answer: will I marry? Will I have children? Will I die young? Are the questions of girls at the threshold of adulthood, confronting their futures. The ritual gives the group permission to be frightened together, to test each other's courage, to share in an intense collective experience that bonds them. The mirror, in this context, is the classic liminal object, a threshold that marks a passage, a surface that separates what you were from what you are becoming. There are quieter versions of mirror ritual that deserve mention alongside the more dramatic Bloody Mary tradition. In many cultures, mirrors are believed to reveal things that ordinary vision cannot. The Victorian practice of scrying, about which we will speak at greater length in the next chapter, used mirrors and crystal balls and bowls of dark water to receive visions. In Japanese folk tradition, antique mirrors are sometimes said to gradually reveal hidden images as they age. The maboroshi, the phantom image, slowly emerging from the tarnishing silver. In Mexican and South American curanderismo, the folk healing tradition that blends indigenous and Spanish Catholic elements, mirrors are used to diagnose spiritual illness, to locate lost objects and people, and to deflect the evil eye. A healer might pass a mirror over a patient's body, watching the reflection for signs of darkness or disturbance in the spiritual field. What all of these practices share is the mirror as a tool of revelation. The surface does not create what it shows. It reveals what is already there, but not yet visible. This is a gentler, quieter version of mirror magic than the summoning ritual. Not a door through which something might enter, but a window through which something hidden might finally be seen. the candles guttering in the dark bathroom, the whispered name, the face in the glass that is almost, but not quite, your own face. Whatever you believe about what lies behind these experiences, they are among the most vividly reported moments of uncanny perception in ordinary human life. They deserve to be taken seriously, not dismissed as mere superstition, and not accepted uncritically as supernatural contact, but examined with the careful attention that genuinely interesting things deserve. In the late summer of 1848, in a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, two young sisters named Maggie and Kate Fox began to communicate with what they believed to be the spirit of a murdered peddler, using a system of rapping sounds, knocks on the walls and floor that seemed to come from nowhere, answering yes or no questions with one knock or two. Within months, the story had spread across upstate New York. Within years, it had crossed the Atlantic. By the 1870s and 1880s, spiritualism, the belief that the dead could be contacted through specially sensitive individuals called mediums, had become one of the most significant popular movements of the 19th century, claiming millions of adherents in the United States and Europe, attracting serious investigation from scientists and philosophers, and producing an entire cultural vocabulary of the afterlife that has persisted into our own time. Mirrors were there from the beginning. The use of reflective surfaces for communication with the dead was not new to the Victorians, of course. Crystal balls and polished metal mirrors had been used by cunning folk and astrologers for centuries. John Dee, the Elizabethan mathematician and royal advisor, famously used a polished obsidian mirror, now in the collection of the British Museum, to communicate with what he called angels, receiving detailed messages that his assistant Edward Kelly translated from the visions they saw in the surface. Nostradamus reportedly made his predictions by gazing into bowls of water in darkness. The tradition was old, but the Victorian spiritualist movement industrialized it, in a sense. Scrying, the practice of seeking visions in a reflective or translucent surface, became a respectable parlor activity, discussed in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research alongside levitation and automatic writing. Scientific gentlemen sat in drawing rooms and stared into crystal balls, carefully noting their visions in research journals. The most rigorous Victorian investigation of mirror scrying was probably the work of Frederick Myers and other members of the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882. Myers collected hundreds of testimonies from people who had used mirrors or crystals for scrying, and he was careful to distinguish between different categories of experience. Some people saw nothing at all. Some saw colored lights or geometric patterns, what Myers called lower-order phenomena. A smaller number saw what appeared to be coherent scenes. Rooms, landscapes, people moving about their business, sometimes scenes that turned out to correspond to real events happening elsewhere. Myers was not credulous, but he was genuinely puzzled. The more dramatic scrying reports, the ones that seemed to show real events at a distance, or scenes from the past, or images of people who were not present, could not be easily explained by the optical science of the day. He proposed tentatively that the reflective surface might act as a kind of focus for latent psychic abilities that everyone possessed, but few had cultivated. We now have better neuroscience than Myers did, and the experiences he collected can largely be explained within a contemporary framework. But the experiences themselves were genuine, and the Victorians' careful documentation of them is genuinely valuable. The seance room, as it developed through the late 19th century, used mirrors with considerable sophistication. A common arrangement involved a large mirror, sometimes tilted slightly to show the ceiling rather than the seated participants, in which the manifestations produced by the medium could be observed. Ghostly lights, shadowy figures, what appeared to be faces forming in the darkness. These were reflected in the mirror for the benefit of the group. Some of these manifestations were, as we now know, produced by fraud. The history of Victorian spiritualism is substantially a history of exposure, of mediums caught using phosphorescent paint, hidden accomplices, specially constructed tables, and darkened cabinets. The most famous physical mediums of the era were, in many cases, skilled stage magicians operating under the cover of religious belief. But the fraud is not the whole story. Many of the people who attended seances reported genuine, inexplicable experiences, and the evidence suggests that they were not all deceived. The conditions of the seance room, the darkness, the group expectation, the rhythmic singing and chanting, the sustained focus on a single point of light, or the reflective surface of the mirror, were highly effective at producing the same kinds of altered perceptual states that we have already discussed in the context of mirror scrying rituals. In the Victorian seance, the mirror served multiple purposes. It was literally reflective. It showed the participants' images, whether produced fraudulently or by their own altered perception. It was also symbolically reflective. It represented the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the thin membrane through which contact might be made. And it was atmospherically reflective. The sight of a large dark mirror in a candlelit room, surrounded by people expecting to see something, created a powerful, effective environment in which unusual perceptions became much more likely. One of the most interesting Victorian figures in the history of mirror divination is Catherine Crowe, whose 1848 book, The Night Side of Nature, was among the most widely read supernatural compilations of the century. Crowe was a careful and skeptical collector of strange experiences, and her chapter on catoptromancy, mirror divination, contains a number of reports that she verified as best she could through personal interview and correspondence. She was neither a credulous believer nor a dismissive skeptic. She was, in the best Victorian tradition, simply trying to understand what was happening. The night side of nature, the phrase is beautiful and apt. The Victorians, for all their industrialism and rationalism, were deeply aware that human experience contained a night side. Dreams, trances, hallucinations, the strange perceptions that came in states between waking and sleeping, the images that rose unbidden in mirrors and dark water. They were the first culture to try to investigate this night side systematically, using the tools of science, and what they found both confirmed and complicated everything that had come before. There is another Victorian tradition involving mirrors that is less dramatic, but perhaps more culturally pervasive: the use of mirrors in mourning practice. We touched on this in the previous chapter, but the Victorian elaboration of it deserves separate attention. Victorian mourning culture was, by our standards, extraordinarily elaborate. It had precise rules about clothing, about social behavior, about which activities were and were not appropriate at each stage of the mourning period. The covering of mirrors was one of these practices, but it came with layers of specific reasoning that earlier traditions lacked. Some Victorian sources suggest that mirrors were covered to prevent the spirit of the deceased from catching sight of itself and becoming confused, lingering in the house rather than moving on. Others say the mirrors were covered out of respect for the grief of the bereaved, Who should not, in the early days of loss, be confronted with their own appearance, their own continuing physical existence, when someone they loved had ceased to exist in physical form? Still others say the mirrors were covered to prevent any image of the corpse from being reflected and potentially trapping the soul. What is notable here is that the Victorians had multiple competing explanations for the same practice, and they seemed comfortable holding all of them simultaneously. The mirror was covered because of the soul, and because of grief, and because of respect. The reasons layered over each other like sediment, each generation adding its own interpretation to a practice whose original meaning had perhaps been lost. This is how folk beliefs actually work. They are not logical systems with clear premises and conclusions. They are accumulations, practices that began for one reason, persisted because they felt right, acquired new explanations as worldviews changed, and survive today as behaviors whose original meaning we often cannot precisely recover. The mirror in the seance room, the mirror covered with black cloth, the crystal ball catching the candlelight. All of these are part of the same long story. The story of human beings trying to see, through the thin reflecting surface, something of what lies beyond the ordinary visible world. Somewhere in the temporal lobe of your brain, there is a small region that does nothing but recognize faces. It is called the fusiform face area, and it is remarkably specialized. Damage to this region, through stroke, injury, or certain neurological conditions, produces a syndrome called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, in which the ability to recognize familiar faces is lost entirely. People with severe prosopagnosia cannot recognize their own children by their faces. They cannot recognize themselves in photographs. They develop workarounds, recognizing people by their gait, their voice, the color of their hair. But the face itself has become an illegible document. This is striking enough on its own. But there is another condition, rarer and stranger, that reveals something even more interesting about how the brain constructs the experience of familiarity. Capgras delusion is a psychiatric syndrome in which a person becomes convinced that someone close to them, a spouse, a parent, a child, has been replaced by an imposter. The imposter looks exactly like the real person, sounds exactly like them, remembers everything the real person would remember. But they are not the person with Capgras delusion is certain, actually that person. Something is missing. Something is wrong. The contemporary explanation for Capgras delusion involves the disconnection between two systems that normally work together. When you see a familiar face, your brain does two things simultaneously. It recognizes the face, the fusiform face area is involved here, and it generates an emotional response of familiarity and warmth. The amygdala and related structures are involved here. These two responses normally arrive together, reinforcing each other. The face you recognize is also the face that produces the warm, immediate sense of knowing the person. In Capgras delusion, these two systems have become disconnected. The recognition still occurs. The face is identified as matching the stored template, but the emotional response of familiarity does not follow. The person looks exactly like the spouse, but the feeling of it being the spouse is absent. The brain, confronted with this discrepancy, generates an explanation. This must be an imposter. Someone who looks exactly like the real person, but is not them. The condition is genuinely distressing for everyone involved. The patient is not lying or playing games. They are reporting their actual subjective experience, which is that the person before them is strange, is wrong, is other. Now consider what happens when a person with Capgras delusion looks in a mirror. There are clinical case reports, not common but documented, of patients who develop what is called mirrored self-misidentification. They do not recognize the person in the mirror as themselves. They believe they are looking at another person, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a benign figure, sometimes a threatening one, who happens to be occupying the space on the other side of the glass. Some patients become angry at this figure. Some try to communicate with it. Some try to reach into the mirror to touch it. From the inside, this experience must feel like a kind of horror. The ordinary world suddenly populated by doubles, by imposters, by faces that are familiar and yet irrecoverably wrong. But it also illuminates, with unusual clarity, just how constructed the sense of self-recognition actually is. You do not see yourself in the mirror the way you see a rock or a chair. You see yourself through a complex neural process that involves not just visual recognition, but emotional confirmation, a resonance between what you see and what you know yourself to be. When that resonance fails, the face in the mirror is a stranger. This neurological reality sits, I think, at the heart of a great many mirror superstitions. The face in the mirror is always, even in ordinary healthy perception, slightly strange. It is reversed. It is slightly stiff, lacking the micro movements of expression that animate a living face. It shows you a version of yourself that you never directly see, only access through this artificial mediation. Mirror gazing, as we discussed in the context of Capgras Signore, also has a more diffuse effect that most people have experienced without ever putting a name to it. Look at your own face in a mirror for long enough. Not the quick checking glance of the bathroom, but a sustained, attentive gaze. And something begins to happen. The face starts to look strange. The features seem unfamiliar. The person looking back seems, incrementally, to become less recognizably you. This is called jamais vu, the opposite of déjà vu. Where déjà vu is the feeling that something new is familiar, jamais vu is the feeling that something familiar has become strange. It happens with words too. Say any word often enough, and it begins to sound like gibberish, to lose its meaning, to become merely sound. Your face in the mirror is, under sustained attention, vulnerable to the same process. The neural patterns that encode it as yours can become temporarily fatigued, and in that fatigue, the face becomes other. The German word unheimlich, which Freud appropriated and which gets translated as uncanny, literally means unhomely, not home. It refers to the experience of the familiar becoming strange, the domestic becoming threatening, the home becoming unhome. Freud located the uncanny specifically in the experience of the double, the doppelganger, the mirror image, the identical other who is not other at all, but is somehow inexplicably terrifying. His essay on the subject, Das Unheimliche, published in 1919, drew on the work of the German psychiatrist Otto Rank, who had catalogued the extraordinary frequency of double imagery in literature, myth, and folklore across cultures. Rank found that the double, the shadow, the reflection, the spirit twin, was almost universally understood in ancient cultures as an omen of death. To see your own double, to meet yourself coming the other way, was to be warned that your end was near. Freud's explanation was psychological rather than supernatural. The double represents the primitive, pre-rational mind's attempt to deny death by creating an immortal copy of the self. The reflection is the first double, the original technology of immortality, the soul made visible. But because the reflected image is associated with the soul, it is also associated with death. The loss of the reflection means the loss of the soul, which means the end of life. This is why, in so many folk traditions, vampires and ghosts cast no reflection. A being without a soul has no double. The mirror, which shows the soul, has nothing to show. Whether or not we accept the Freudian framework, the clinical reality of conditions like Capgras delusion and mirrored self-misidentification tells us something important. The experience of self-recognition in a mirror is not simple, not guaranteed, and not entirely stable. It is an achievement, a continuous, effortful construction by a brain that is doing something quite remarkable. And when that construction falters even briefly, the face in the mirror is a stranger. No wonder our ancestors treated it with such care. In the early 1990s, a group of Italian neuroscientists at the University of Parma were studying motor neurons in macaque monkeys, the neurons that fire when a monkey performs a specific physical action, like reaching for a piece of food. They had implanted electrodes to monitor individual neurons, and they were carefully mapping which neurons corresponded to which movements. And then something unexpected happened. One of the neurons they were monitoring fired, not when the monkey reached for food, but when the monkey watched a researcher reach for food. The same neuron that encoded the action also responded to the observation of the action. This was, when the finding was eventually published and replicated, a genuinely significant discovery. The neurons in question came to be called mirror neurons, and the broader system of which they appeared to be a part came to be called the mirror neuron system. The implications were far-reaching. If neurons that encode the performance of an action also fire when observing the same action performed by another, then the brain is in some sense simulating the actions it observes, not just registering them as visual events, but running them through its own motor system, experiencing them from the inside. When you watch someone reach for an object, part of your brain activates as though you were reaching for it yourself. The mirror neuron system is now understood to be involved in far more than motor imitation. It appears to underlie the capacity for empathy, the ability to feel something of what another person is feeling by simulating their experience in your own nervous system. When you wince at someone else's pain, when you feel anxious watching a tense scene in a film, when you tear up at music you have heard 100 times before, these responses involve your brain's ability to mirror the states it observes. This is, in a sense, a neural version of the ancient belief that the mirror is a threshold through which states can pass. The metaphor has reversed. Instead of your soul passing out through the mirror into another realm, the states of others pass into you through the mirror of perception. You are always, at some level, reflecting the people around you, and they are reflecting you. The mirror neuron system does not function in isolation. It is one component of a vastly complex social nervous system that also includes the capacity for theory of mind, understanding that other people have inner lives, beliefs, and perspectives different from your own, and the capacity for emotional regulation, the ability to manage your own emotional states in response to what you experience. When the system is functioning well, it allows for rich, nuanced social experience, the ability to read subtle emotional cues, to anticipate how others might respond, to feel genuinely connected to other people's experiences without losing your own perspective. When it malfunctions or is chronically overwhelmed, the results can be quite different. In the context of modern life, and particularly modern digital life, the mirror neuron system is being subjected to stimuli that it did not evolve to handle. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, the social world was small and largely consistent. A person might interact, over a lifetime, with hundreds or perhaps a few thousand other people. The emotional states you were exposed to, the social comparisons available to you, the images of human bodies and faces you encountered, all of these were drawn from a limited, local pool. The smartphone changed this in ways we are only beginning to understand. The average social media user now encounters hundreds or thousands of images of human faces and bodies every day, curated, filtered, optimized, selected by algorithms for maximum engagement. The social comparison processes that evolved to help us navigate a small community are now running continuously against an effectively infinite pool of curated images. The results are visible in public health data. Rates of body dysmorphic disorder, a condition in which a person becomes preoccupied with perceived flaws in their appearance, often flaws that are not visible to others, have risen significantly in the smartphone era, particularly among young people. The condition is not new. Victorian and Edwardian literature contains recognizable descriptions of it, and there are clinical reports going back to the early 20th century. But the prevalence has increased, and the specific content of the preoccupations has shifted. Where earlier sufferers of body dysmorphia worried predominantly about specific facial features, the nose, the skin, the hairline, contemporary cases increasingly involve concerns about whether the face looks as it does in photographs, or specifically in the particular kind of slightly distorted photograph produced by front-facing smartphone cameras. The smartphone camera, particularly in selfie mode, uses a relatively wide-angle lens at close range. This creates a mild fisheye distortion that slightly enlarges the features closest to the camera, usually the nose. It also freezes the face in a single moment, depriving it of the animation that makes faces legible as human. Cosmetic surgeons have reported seeing patients who come in with photographs of themselves taken on their phones, asking to have features corrected that do not, in the surgeon's assessment, actually need correction. The photograph has become the mirror, and the mirror is lying, or at least distorting. This phenomenon has been given a name: Snapchat dysmorphia, after the social media platform that popularized facial filters. The name is slightly misleading because the issue extends far beyond any single platform. What it describes is a population of people who have begun to compare their real faces, the faces in actual mirrors, unfavorably to their filtered, optimized digital faces, and who experience distress as a result. The digital echo chamber adds another dimension. Recommendation algorithms are designed to show you content similar to content you have already engaged with. On social media platforms, this means that your feed increasingly reflects your existing interests, your existing anxieties, your existing aesthetic preferences, amplified and concentrated. The echo chamber is a kind of mirror. It shows you yourself, but louder, more extreme, more certain than the original. Communities built around body image, around dietary restriction, around physical appearance, have been shown to intensify the preoccupations of their members through exactly this mechanism. The mirror neuron system encounters a continuous stream of images and narratives that simulate the emotional states of people deeply invested in these preoccupations. The brain begins to inhabit these states. These are, in their own way, digital versions of the ancient concern about the mirror as a threshold. Something is crossing the reflective surface into the viewer. The viewer is being changed by what they see. The old folk wisdom that you should be careful about what you look at in a mirror, that you should not look too long, that the reflection has power over the person who gazes, may have been encoded in supernatural language, but the underlying warning was sound. Light, at the most fundamental level we currently understand, does not behave the way our intuitions expect it to. A photon, a single particle of light traveling through space, can be made to behave as a particle or as a wave, depending on whether and how you observe it. This is not a philosophical statement about the limits of knowledge. It is an empirical fact, confirmed by countless experiments since the early 20th century. The act of observation appears to influence the behavior of the observed. At the quantum level, the mirror is not passive. The reflection of light from a surface at the quantum mechanical level is stranger than it appears. When a photon strikes a reflective surface and bounces back, the full quantum mechanical description of this event involves the photon, in some sense, taking all possible paths simultaneously, going in every direction at once, with the observed reflection being the result of the interference of these infinite possible trajectories. The clean, crisp reflection you see in a mirror is the emergent product of an unimaginably complex quantum process, happening trillions of times per second. This is not to say that there is anything mysterious or supernatural about reflection in the physics sense. The quantum mechanical description of light is extraordinarily well confirmed and extraordinarily well understood, at least mathematically. But it is a reminder that the phenomena we take to be simple and transparent, light, reflection, appearance, are built on a foundation of genuine physical strangeness. The physicist Richard Feynman, who contributed enormously to our understanding of quantum electrodynamics, the science of how light and matter interact, wrote accessibly about the quantum behavior of mirrors in his book QED, The Strange Theory of Light and Matter. His account involves a vision of the photon performing a kind of exploration of all possible paths, and the reflection emerging from the cancellation of all the impossible paths. It is, he noted, genuinely counterintuitive. The world at the level we can see is a simplification of a stranger reality beneath. There are also interesting things to say about mirrors in the context of general relativity and the geometry of spacetime. Einstein showed that mass curves spacetime, that what we experience as gravitational attraction is actually the curvature of the fabric of the universe itself. In extremely strong gravitational fields, light bends. Mirrors near very massive objects would reflect images that are displaced from where they appear to be. The image would not show you the world as it is, but the world as it was. The time delay imposed by the curvature of space. We don't encounter gravity strong enough to produce noticeable optical distortions in everyday life, but the principle is worth holding. Even at the level of general relativity, the mirror is not a simple passive reflector. It is embedded in a curved dynamic space-time, and what it shows you is conditioned by that embedding. These are pleasing reminders that the ancient intuition, the mirror shows you something other than simple reality, has a basis in physics, even if that basis is not what the ancients imagined. The more immediate contemporary concern about mirrors and technology involves the smart mirror, a class of device that has been gradually developing over the past decade and is now commercially available in various forms. A smart mirror looks like an ordinary mirror but incorporates a display behind its reflective surface, a camera and microphone for input, and a processor connected to the internet. It can show you the news, weather, and your calendar while you brush your teeth. It can analyze your complexion and suggest skincare products. It can monitor your vital signs, heart rate, respiration, skin temperature, using the camera. The appeal of these devices is legible. The morning routine, during which we already habitually consult the mirror, becomes more informationally rich. You are already there, already looking. The concern is equally legible, and it maps onto very old anxieties in new language. The smart mirror is observing you. It is recording data about your face, your body, your habits. The reflection is no longer passive. It is active, collecting information, potentially transmitting it to servers in data centers owned by corporations whose interests are not identical to yours. Privacy researchers have raised specific concerns about smart mirror technology, that the continuous facial analysis required for health monitoring constitutes a form of biometric surveillance, that the data collected could be used for purposes other than those disclosed, that the always-on nature of the device makes it difficult to guarantee when it is and is not collecting data. These are reasonable concerns, and they connect to broader anxieties about the surveillance capabilities of connected devices that have become so integrated into domestic space that we have stopped noticing them. The smart speaker, the connected television, the laptop with its always visible camera, all of these are, in a sense, new kinds of mirrors. They reflect your presence back to systems that are making inferences about you. The old superstition that being seen is being vulnerable, that the observer has power over the observed, has found a new and specifically technological expression. The evil eye of folk tradition, the gaze that could harm through the act of seeing, has been replaced in the contemporary imagination by the surveillance apparatus of the data economy. To be observed, cataloged, and analyzed is to be, in some sense, captured. Some of the most interesting contemporary art about mirrors engages directly with these anxieties. Artists working in digital media have produced installations that use facial recognition technology to show viewers distorted or altered versions of their own faces, or to display data about what the technology infers from those faces: age, gender, emotional state, attention. The experience of these installations is consistently described by viewers as unsettling, not because the technology is wrong, but because it is right, or near enough right, in ways that feel like an intrusion. The ancient Egyptians, covering their mirrors to protect the Ka, were addressing an anxiety that contemporary technology has reactivated in new terms. What if the thing that sees you also takes something from you? What if being reflected is being diminished? What if the threshold goes both ways? Rest in the quiet of that question. The mirror watches. The mirror remembers. The mirror, increasingly, is also thinking. In 2015, a software feature called a filter was introduced to a social media application, and the world changed in ways that are still being measured. Filters, in the photographic sense, were not new. Color correction, vignetting, contrast adjustment. Photographers had been manipulating images since photography existed. What was new was the application of real-time facial analysis and transformation to the front-facing camera of a smartphone, available to anyone, immediately. A person could now see, in the moment before taking a photograph, a version of their face that had been algorithmically smoothed, brightened, symmetrized, de-blemished, and in some cases radically restructured. The most popular early filters were playful: dog ears, flower crowns, comic effects. But more sophisticated beauty filters followed quickly, and these operated in a different register. They did not transform the face into something obviously artificial. They transformed it into an idealized, plausibly real version of itself. Smooth skin, larger eyes, more defined cheekbones, a smaller nose, the kind of face that, if you showed a photograph of it to someone, they might believe was a beautiful human being rather than an algorithmic construction. These filters are now extraordinarily widespread. A significant portion of the photographs that circulate on social media platforms have been filtered, to degrees ranging from subtle to substantial. The visual environment of the internet, in which billions of images circulate daily, has become partly a constructed reality, a space in which the reflective surface has been adjusted. The effects of this adjustment on individual psychology have been studied with increasing urgency. We mentioned Snapchat dysmorphia in the previous chapter, the tendency of some users to compare their unfiltered real faces unfavorably to their filtered digital images. But the issue extends beyond clinical cases. Surveys of social media users consistently find that exposure to idealized images, including filtered images of acquaintances, not just celebrities, is associated with decreased body satisfaction and increased social comparison. The effect is stronger when the images come from people the viewer knows, perhaps because they are less easy to dismiss as artificially idealized. The filter creates a new kind of mirror problem. The ancient worry was that the mirror shows you your soul, your true self, your double, and that this true self might be captured or damaged. The contemporary worry is almost the inverse, that the mirror no longer shows your true self at all, that the true self has been replaced by an optimized version, and that you are now measured against that optimized version and found wanting. The AI avatar extends this logic further. Several commercial platforms now offer the ability to create a fully synthetic image of yourself, an AI-generated portrait that is drawn from your photographs, but elaborated by a generative model trained on thousands of images of attractive human beings. The result is, in the words of many users, the best version of themselves. It looks recognizably like them, but it is constructed from an enormous training set of curated beauty, and it reflects that training in ways that the actual face cannot. The AI avatar is, in some ways, the modern equivalent of the idealized portrait. The tradition, from ancient Egypt through Renaissance Europe, of commissioning a representation of yourself that was both recognizable and improved. Pharaohs had themselves depicted with the faces of gods. Tudor monarchs sat for portraits that bore a resemblance to their actual appearance, filtered through the painter's training in idealized classical forms. But the scale and accessibility are new, and the relationship between the representation and the self is different. A Tudor portrait hung in a great hall and was seen by a limited number of people. An AI avatar circulates on social platforms and is seen by hundreds or thousands. And crucially, it is seen by the person it represents, who lives with the comparison between the AI version and the reflection in the bathroom mirror every day. Some researchers have begun to describe social media use in terms directly analogous to mirror superstition. The concept of the social media feed as a mirror has been developed seriously in psychology. It reflects you back, but through the mediation of others' perceptions and the platform's algorithms. What you see in the feed is not reality and not fiction, but a curated construction. Like the seance mirror, it shows you something. But what it shows you is shaped by forces you do not fully control. The validation loop, post an image, receive likes and comments, feel good or bad depending on the response, is a kind of ritual not entirely unlike the ritual consultation of a mirror for divination. The question is not, will I marry? But the question is equally existential. Am I attractive? Am I valued? Am I good enough? The mirror is consulted for an answer, and the answer it gives is conditional, variable, dependent on timing, and audience and luck. One of the more philosophically interesting developments in AI image generation has been the creation of fully synthetic human faces. Faces that do not belong to any real person, but are completely convincing as photographs of real people. Websites like "This person does not exist" generate new faces on demand. The faces look at you from the screen with the same directness as the face in a mirror. They have the same micro-expressions, the same asymmetries, the same apparent individuality, but there is no one there. The face has no soul to capture, no double in the water. It is a pattern extracted from millions of real faces and recombined into something that has never existed. It is perhaps the purest mirror image, a reflection with no original. The folk traditions that worried about mirrors capturing souls, or showing things that had no right to be shown, or becoming windows for entities that should not cross, these traditions could not have anticipated the specific forms that the digital mirror would take. But the underlying anxiety maps surprisingly well. The digital space is full of faces with uncertain relationships to real selves. The image circulates and persists long after the moment it was taken. The reflection outlives the original. We are living, in other words, inside a new version of a very old story. There is a room in the Palace of Versailles that has been making visitors uneasy for 350 years. The Hall of Mirrors, the Galerie de Glace, was completed in 1684 under the direction of Louis XIV's architects Jules Hardouin-Mansart and Charles Lebrun. It runs along the west facade of the palace for 73 meters, lined on one side with 17 tall arched mirrors, and on the other with 17 windows of the same size and shape, looking out over the formal gardens. When the sun is at the right angle, the reflected light fills the room with a quality that contemporary visitors described as supernatural. Bright beyond brightness, space made infinite, the distinction between the inside and outside of the building dissolving into pure luminosity. Louis built the Hall of Mirrors to impress, and it does impress. But the particular quality of unease that very large mirror rooms produce is not purely a response to grandeur. Something else happens when you are surrounded by your own reflection on multiple sides. Psychologists have studied the effect of self-awareness cues on behavior and report consistent findings. The presence of a mirror makes people more self-conscious, more careful about their actions, more reflective in the literal sense of being aware of themselves as observed. Studies conducted in rooms with mirrors consistently show increased self-monitoring and decreased impulsive behavior compared to control rooms without mirrors. The mirror creates a kind of permanent internal observer. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, this effect is magnified enormously. You cannot look anywhere without seeing yourself and the others around you, replicated and extending. The reflected light is beautiful, but it is also relentless. There is no privacy, no angle of escape from your own image. The room performs architecturally the fantasy of complete visibility and makes palpable the slight claustrophobia that complete visibility can produce. The infinity mirror takes this effect to its logical extreme. An infinity mirror consists of two parallel mirrors facing each other, creating an apparently endless corridor of reflections that recede into a vanishing point. The image produced is of a tunnel extending forever, or apparently forever, because the reflections do grow dimmer with each iteration until they fade into darkness. Infinity mirrors have become fixtures of contemporary experiential art and interior design. The Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama has created numerous installation works based on infinity mirror rooms, in which the viewer stands inside a space lined entirely with mirrors and scattered with lights that recede in all directions. The experience of standing inside one of these rooms is consistently described as vertiginous, as oceanic, as a dissolution of the sense of where your body ends and the space begins. Kusama herself has spoken about these works in terms that directly echo the ancient language of mirrors as thresholds. For her, the infinity mirror rooms represent the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, a dissolution that she experiences as both terrifying and liberating, given that she has struggled throughout her life with the boundary between her own mind and the visual hallucinations that characterize her condition. The architecture of liminal spaces, spaces that exist between categories, on the threshold between one state and another, has always been associated with mirror-like qualities. Corridors, thresholds, stairwells, waiting rooms, the lobby of a hotel at 3 a.m. These are spaces that are not quite inside and not quite outside, that exist for passing through rather than for dwelling in, that have a quality of temporal suspension that distinguishes them from the purposeful rooms on either side. The internet phenomenon of liminal spaces, which emerged as an aesthetic and became briefly widespread in the late 2000s and early 2020s, captures this quality precisely. Images of empty malls, fluorescent-lit corridors, abandoned playgrounds at dusk. These spaces have a quality that is immediately recognizable, but difficult to articulate. They feel like places you have been before, in dreams. They feel like the spaces between other, more real spaces. They feel like reflections of places, true enough to be recognizable, wrong enough to be unsettling. The connection to mirrors is not incidental. The liminal space aesthetic draws directly on the same psychological resources as mirror uncanniness. The familiar made strange, the expected emptied of its content, the threshold suspended between crossing and not crossing. In religious architecture across many cultures, mirrors and reflective surfaces have been used precisely because of their liminal quality, their ability to create the sensation of being at a threshold. The use of gold mosaic in Byzantine churches, covering the walls and vaults in a continuous field of reflective light, creates an environment in which the solid material world seems to dissolve into luminosity. The effect is deliberately disorienting. You are not quite sure whether you are inside or outside, looking up or looking across, occupying real space or a space beyond the ordinary physical world. The Japanese concept of ema, often translated as negative space or pause, the meaningful gap between things, has a relevance here. Ma is not emptiness. It is the generative space between presences, the silence between notes that makes music possible. Mirrors in some Japanese aesthetic traditions are associated with Ma. They are not simply reflective surfaces, but intervals, pauses in the continuity of the visible world through which something else can be glimpsed. Contemporary designers working with mirror installations often report the same phenomenological observations that mirror makers have been making for centuries. That very large or very numerous mirrors change the quality of presence in a room in ways that purely visual analysis does not fully explain. The room feels different. Visitors behave differently. Time seems to pass at a different rate. The most extreme version of this effect is produced in sensory deprivation chambers, which are not mirrors in the conventional sense, but which produce the same kind of blank, featureless reflective surface in which the face in mirror distortions and hallucinatory experiences we discussed earlier are strongly induced. In the absence of external input, the brain generates its own. The liminal space is a threshold, and the threshold is a mirror, and the mirror is a threshold. These metaphors circle back on each other because they are pointing at the same underlying reality, the edge between one state and another, the pause before the transition, the space where the familiar world becomes uncertain, and the unknown world has not yet declared itself. Rest in that pause for a moment. The door not yet opened, the reflection not yet forming, the space between the mirrors where the light travels but the eye cannot follow. We have traveled a long way through the dark tonight. We began beside still water with the first glimpse of a human face reflected back to itself, the moment when self-awareness and the anxiety of self-awareness came into existence together, inseparable, each the condition of the other. We have passed through ancient Egypt and the bronze mirrors buried with the dead, through Greek myths of the dangerous gaze, through Roman households covering their mirrors against the weakened souls of the sick. We have sat in Victorian drawing rooms while scrying mirrors caught candlelight, and in darkened bathrooms where children whispered name 3 times. We have walked through the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and stood inside the infinite corridor of an infinity installation and glimpsed the fluorescent liminal spaces of the internet age. What have we found? The simplest answer is this. Mirrors matter to human beings in ways that go beyond their obvious utility, and they always have. The reflection is not merely information about your appearance. It is an encounter with the self as other, a meeting with a version of yourself that is simultaneously identical to you and irrecoverably separate, that lives in a different world by different rules, that is silent when you speak and dark when you are not there to illuminate it. Every culture that has had access to reflective surfaces has responded to this encounter with a rich body of belief, practice, and caution. The beliefs differ in their details. The sole concept of one tradition is not identical to the sole concept of another, and the specific rituals of covering mirrors in a house of mourning have different explanations in different cultural contexts. But the underlying concern is consistent. The mirror is a threshold, and thresholds require respect. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, writing about hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, used the metaphor of the mirror frequently. For Gadamer, understanding was itself a kind of reflection. We understand new things by seeing them reflected in the context of what we already know, and we understand ourselves by encountering the other and seeing ourselves reflected back in that encounter. The self is not self-contained. It is constituted in reflection. This is, I think, one of the deepest truths that mirror superstitions encode, even if they encode it in symbolic rather than philosophical language. The self is a reflective structure. We know who we are partly by what we see in the mirror, not just the physical mirror, but the social mirror of how others respond to us, the cultural mirror of the stories our society tells about people like us, the temporal mirror of how we compare our present self to past and future selves. When these mirrors are distorted, when the social feedback is cruel, when the cultural stories are dehumanizing, when the comparison to past or future selves is unforgiving, the self is genuinely affected. This is not a metaphor. The research on the psychological effects of social comparison, on the damage done by relentless self-monitoring, on the particular harms of digital beauty culture, all of this documents, in the language of contemporary psychology, what the mirror superstitions expressed in the language of souls and spirits, that what you see in the mirror has power over you, and that this power should not be treated carelessly. There is also something to be said for the old practice of covering the mirror. Not literally or not necessarily, though there is a wisdom in the mourning custom that we might do well to consider. The principle of the covered mirror is the principle of chosen not looking, of acknowledging that there are times when the gaze is not helpful, when the reflective encounter needs to pause, when the self benefits from not being continuously observed, even by itself. In an era of smartphones and social media and smart mirrors and front-facing cameras, the practice of not looking, of removing yourself from the reflective loop for a period of time, is increasingly considered a form of self-care, of mental hygiene. Digital detoxes, screen-free time, the deliberate choice to close the front-facing camera and spend time not documenting yourself. These are contemporary versions of an ancient practice. The mirror, finally, is a metaphor for consciousness itself. The word reflect means both to show a mirrored image and to engage in careful thought. We reflect on things. We reflect on ourselves. The metaphor is not accidental. The capacity for self-reflection, in both the optical and the cognitive sense, is one of the things that makes us distinctively human. The ancient belief that reflective surfaces are thresholds, that they are not fully of this world, that they connect to something beyond the ordinary visible, is, in philosophical terms, a recognition of this. Consciousness is itself a threshold experience. We exist at the edge between the physical processes of the brain and the subjective experience of being a self. The mirror represents this threshold, makes it visible, gives it a physical form you can hold in your hands. The neurologist Antonio Damasio, writing about the biological basis of consciousness, has argued that the self is not a thing, but a process, a continuous, active construction, rebuilt moment by the brain using memories, perceptions, and bodily sensations as its raw materials. The self is not located anywhere in the brain. It emerges from the activity of the brain, the way a reflection emerges from the activity of light on a surface. There is something almost vertiginous in this picture. The face in the mirror is the reflection of a face that is itself a construction, a process, an emergence. Below the reflected surface, below the physical face, below the neural activity, there is nothing quite like the solid, continuous self we take for granted. There is activity, there is process, there is the ceaseless work of consciousness maintaining its own coherence against the entropy that surrounds it. No wonder our ancestors were unsettled by their reflections. They were looking at the right thing to be unsettled by. And yet, and this is perhaps the most important thing to hold as we come to the end of this journey, the mirror is not only a source of unease, it is also a source of recognition. The face in the glass is you. It is strange. It is other. It reverses your world and shows you a version of yourself you can never quite know directly. And yet it is also unmistakably, continuously, reliably you. To look in a mirror is to be reminded of this remarkable fact, that there is a self here, that this self has a face, that this face persists through time and change, and the wear of living. The reflection in the morning light, the familiar features rearranging themselves into the expression you wear as you wake. There is something reassuring in this, something quietly extraordinary. The soul, if there is a soul, is not stolen by the glass. The self, if there is a self, is not captured by the image. We look and we are looked at, and we continue. Thank you for spending this night in quiet exploration of these long-held beliefs and the curious, enduring wisdom they contain. If these slow journeys through the night side of history bring you rest, I hope you will return. There are many more thresholds to stand at, gently, together. Sleep well. The mirror, for now, is dark.